Hello, welcome to another scary story that you can fall asleep to. Elias Thorne had always believed that true terror was an active, kinetic thing, a charging animal, a sudden crash, the sting of betrayal. He was a man who trusted what he could see, measure, and logically dismantle. His grandfather, Arthur, had been the opposite, a collector of shadows, a keeper of secrets, and a steadfast believer in the cold, primordial things that dwelt just beyond the edge of the firelight. This philosophical chasm was why Elias hadn't seen Arthur in 15 years, and why, now, he found himself pulling his beat up Ford pickup onto a dirt track known locally as the Widow's Path. The air here, deep in the Olympic Peninsula, was so thick with pine and brine that it tasted like distilled melancholy. The fog wasn't a weather pattern. It felt like a static, breathing entity clinging to the dense canopy of ancient spruce and hemlock, pressing down the light and sound into an oppressive silence. This was the inheritance the Oakhaven Lodge Arthur's remote estate willed to Elias, the only living relative desperate enough to claim it. The widow's path was barely wide enough for the truck, the moss, slicked trees scraping against the paint on either side. It felt less like a drive and more like a descent, the dense woods swallowing the last vestiges of civilization. Elias gripped the wheel, his knuckles white, his skepticism struggling against the sheer, physical weight of the place. He come here to sell, to liquidate, to turn the old man, superstitious property into a down payment on a life that was stable, bright, and far from the sea. Soaked shadows. The track terminated abruptly at a wrought iron gate, a snarled, black silhouette against the gray wall of the forest. It wasn't T-locked, but secured with a thick salt, rusted chain wrapped around the central pillars, clearly untouched for years. Elias cut the engine. The resulting silence was startling, heavy, and absolute, broken only by the drip of moisture from the unseen leaves above. He got out, the gravel crunching under his boots like a hostile protest, and leaned against the gate. He worked the chain free, each link giving up its hold with a reluctant, metallic shriek that echoed unnervingly in the fog. The gate swung inward on hinges that sounded like grieving wails. The lodge sat 200 yards up a slight rise, partially obscured by the mist, but imposing even in its dilapidated state. It was a sprawling, dark structure built from local stone and cedar that had long since weathered to the color of wet bone. It was not quaint. It was architectural malice. The roof was steep, capped by a widow's walk that looked out over what Elias knew, from the old documents, should be the Pacific Ocean, though he could see nothing but a shifting, pearlescent gray wall today. The windows, large and numerous, stared back like vacant, dusty eyes. Elias retrieved his duffel bag and the heavy box containing his grandfather's personal papers, the only things the executor had managed to ship out. He secured the chain on the gate, a purely symbolic gesture in a place where only the forest seemed to hold sway. As he walked up to the front porch, the dread intensified. It wasn't the natural decay, the curling paint, the moss on the gutters, that unnerved him. It was something else, an atmospheric pressure that seemed to emanate from the very wood and stone. On the porch, a cluster of wind chimes, made not of metal but of small, oddly shaped white stones, strung together, hung motionless, despite the damp, swirling air. He pushed them lightly with his finger. They made no sound. They merely shifted, catching the dim light in a way that made Elias pull his hand back instinctively. The key Arthur had left him was massive, cast iron, and cold in his hand. It turned in the lock with the mechanical resistance of a contraption unused for a decade. The door opened with a groan, releasing an odor that hit Elias in a physical wave, a complex, suffocating perfume of dust, mildew, dead things, and something else, a sharp, metallic yet deeply organic smell, like old blood and salt mixed. Inside, the house was a cavern of shadow. He found the breaker box near the kitchen and flipped the main switches, bathing the entrance hall in the weak, buzzing yellow light of a single bare bulb hanging from the high ceiling. The hall was vast, floored with dark oak that looked oily even under the dust. The first room he explored was Arthur's study, the nerve center of the old man's peculiar obsessions. It was lined floor, too, ceiling with bookshelves, but the shelves held more than books. They held specimens, dried kelp arranged like dead calligraphy, bottles containing murky liquids, and heavy ceramic jars stoppered with wax. In the center of the room was a large mahogany desk, perpetually stained with ink and salt spray that must have blown in from the coast. On the desk lay one item, pristine and unmoving, that immediately captured his attention, a large leather bound ledger. It wasn't dusty. It looked like it had been handled just this morning. Elias approached cautiously, feeling the familiar prickle of irritation at his own irrationality. It's an old house, Elias. You alone. Stop projecting. He opened the ledger. The paper inside was thick and yellowed, the script faded and precise. It wasn't a financial record. It was a daily journal. The date on the first visible page was the 4th of June, 1958. His grandfather's writing, stark and unnerving. The silence comes in waves now. It is a hunger, not an absence. It draws the sound out of the air, out of the wood, until the very beating of my heart is an unbearable racket. I saw the children today. They stood on the reef. They never move, but they are closer. I have secured the lock on the cellar door and will not go down again until the moon is dark. The salt is the only defense. I must remember the salt. Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The entries were a tapestry of paranoia and cryptic references. The children on the reef, the drawing of sound, the need for salt. It was exactly the kind of demented nonsense he expected from the old eccentric. He snapped the book shut. He needed coffee and a logical explanation for everything, preferably in that order. The kitchen was large and smelled less actively rotten, perhaps due to years of residual, industrial cleaner. Elias found the sink, tested the water. It sputtered, brown, then cleared, and found a dusty kettle and some instant coffee in a sealed tin. As the kettle began its slow, whining ascent to boiling, Elias wandered back to the main hall. He noticed something he'd missed earlier. Near the heavy, interior door that led, according to the plans, to a utility room and the cellar was a series of deep, vertical scratches on the dark oak. They weren't T-gouges from a chair or a clumsy box. They were fine, distinct score marks, too uniform to be random, too low to be accidental. They were focused near the bottom of the door, just above the skirting board, as if something small and tenacious had been trying to get out. He tried the handle. It was stiff, but not locked. He pulled, and the door opened into absolute lightless black. The air that rushed out was freezing, dry, and carried that potent odor of salt and decay, only 10 times stronger. It was the scent of the sea floor. Long after the tide has gone out, the kettle shrieked in the kitchen, a welcome, human sound that shattered the lodge. Silence, Elias jumped, the panic entirely disproportionate to the event. He slammed the cellar door shut, hearing the latch click into place. He went to the kitchen, poured the steaming brown liquid into a mug, and stood at the window, looking out into the mist. Choked yard, the fog was thinning, slightly revealing the outlines of the ancient pines. As he sipped the bitter coffee, his eyes wandered to the window pane itself. It was covered in a uniform layer of fine interior dust, but at the exact center of the glass, directly opposite where he was standing, was a clean circle, wiped free of dust, about the size of a child's hand. Elias, a man who believed in physics and evidence, knew two things with cold certainty. One, the circle was on the inside of the window, meaning it had been wiped from inside the room. And two, he had been the only person inside Oakhaven Lodge for the last 15 years. He slowly put the mug down. The silence returned, not the absence of sound, but the presence of an immense, waiting quiet. He turned toward the dark hall, suddenly realizing the sound he had heard earlier. The high, pitched whine of the kettle had not merely broken the silence, it had woken something up. The inheritance had begun to collect its tenant. The air in the kitchen, suddenly chilled by the cellar, exhalation felt thin and treacherous. Elias stood motionless for a full minute, staring at the clean circle on the dusty window pane. The coffee mug in his hand was now a useless anchor to a reality that was rapidly dissolving. A child's hand, wiped clean from the inside of a locked and uninhabited house. He forced himself to breathe, deep and slow. There were 100 logical explanations, all of them mundane, and all of them lying to him. Dust is fickle. Drafts happen. Perhaps a cleaning crew had been in the lodge decades ago, and the dust pattern had settled around a handprint that never fully oxidized. He repeated these inadequate excuses in his mind, trying to build a wall of reason against the tide of pure animal panic. Documentation. That was the key. He was a man of evidence. He needed to catalog the anomaly, give it a title, a file number, and a date. He strode back into the study, retrieved a fresh, legal, pad-sized notebook from his duffel, and a ballpoint pen. He sat at his grandfather's heavy desk, the leather, bound ledger open before him, and began to write. Observation 1. Interior dust signature on north, facing kitchen window. A small circular section approx 4 diameter of dust had been physically removed, resembling a child. S. Palm. House was sealed. No entry points observed near window. The act of writing, the mechanical scratch of the pen against the paper, was profoundly comforting. It was a human rhythm fighting against the oppressive silence. He deliberately didn't mention the feeling of dread or the peculiar metallic scent. He was sticking to facts. He turned his attention back to the journal. If Arthur had been insane, his madness was meticulous. The cursive script was neat, even in its descent into terror. Elias flipped deeper into the book, past the initial paranoid ramblings about the silence. He stopped at a page dated the 12th of July, 1965. Oakhaven is not a house, it is a seal. The stones remember what they hold. The boundary must be maintained. The tithing must be paid, or the sea will claim more than sound. Tonight, I saw the tall one among the children. He was in the tide pools, just at the edge of the line. The others were near the reef, always near the reef. They listened for the human noise, the laughter, the voice. They listened for the music to stop. Elias felt a surge of cold comprehension. Arthur hadn't built Oakhaven to keep things out. He had constructed it as a dam, a seal, and whatever was sealed away required a tithing. The implication was stomach turning. Had his grandfather been paying some kind of macabre to keep the children and the tall one at bay? And if so, what kind of currency did the unseen claim? He skimmed further. The entries grew sporadic, fading into weeks, long gaps. The dates became irregular, and the writing itself began to deteriorate, not in legibility, but in character, appearing shaky and rushed. The 3rd of August 1968, a small drawing of a single, rigid figure, like an elongated stick figure, adorned the margin. The line is blurring. They are learning to draw the essence. The photograph is gone. I cannot remember her face. If I cannot recall the laughter, does it mean it never existed? The silence is complete when the memory stops sounding. I must secure the box in the wall. The photograph. Her face. The line ends with me. This confirmed what Elias had always suspected. His grandfather was shielding him from whatever madness consumed his life, ensuring the legacy ended with the property, not the curse. But that last line, the silence is complete when the memory stops sounding, was terrifying in its poetry. It suggested the threat wasn't just auditory. It was existential, consuming the past itself. Elias closed the ledger with a soft thud. He needed to see the reef. He needed to see the spot Arthur had obsessively documented. The widow's path. The widow's walk. He looked up at the ceiling, trying to place the structure above him. The lodge was vast, a labyrinth of high ceilings and heavy wood. He found the staircase leading up to the 2nd floor, hidden behind a heavy velvet curtain near the grand fireplace. It was a narrow, steep affair, made of old mahogany. It looked more like a servant's passage than a main thoroughfare. He began the ascent, his boots loud and clumsy on the uncarpeted risers. Each creak sounded like a pistol shot in the profound quiet of the house. The 2nd floor was a dark corridor lined with closed doors. He tried the first 3 bedrooms, all dusty, beds stripped bare, the air stagnant. He moved quickly, his paranoia urging him onward. At the far end of the hall, near where the roofline peaked, was a smaller unmarked door. This had to be it. The door was secured with a robust, old-fashioned bolt. Elias fumbled with it, the cold metal resisting his grip, until the bolt scraped back with a sound like tearing fabric. He pulled the door open and was met not with another room, but a final, winding spiral staircase made of painted metal, leading straight up into darkness. It smelled of ozone and damp salt, the widow's walk. He started climbing. The metal groaned with his weight, the sound echoing in the vertical shaft. He could hear his own ragged breathing. This is just architecture, Elias. Wood and steel. The staircase opened directly onto a small enclosed glass rotunda. Beyond the glass, a heavy wooden door led outside onto the actual walk, a fenced platform surrounding the chimney and the highest point of the roof. The glass in the rotunda was streaked with a crusty layer of sea salt. He peered through it. The fog was finally beginning to yield. He could see the coastline now. It was a jagged, unforgiving landscape of black rock and gray shingle beach. The tide was far out, exposing enormous, slick black tidal rocks and a long, treacherous expanse of sand. And out there, where the white of the surf met the black water, was the reef, a dark, angular mass, a quarter-mile offshore, looking like the exposed skeleton of some deep sea leviathan. He wrestled with the exterior door. It was swollen with moisture and stiff. He had to shoulder it open. The air on the widow's S walk hit him like a physical blow. It was brutally cold, heavy with moisture, and tasted purely of raw, unadulterated salt. He stepped out onto the narrow platform. The view was breathtakingly, terribly exposed. The forest fell away immediately behind the house, giving way to the cliff face. Elias went to the seaward railing, his eyes fixed on the reef. He searched the jagged peaks of rock, and then he saw them. They were small, dark shapes, exactly as Arthur had described. 3, perhaps 4 of them. They weren't driftwood. They were too symmetrical, too vertical. They were standing on the highest, driest point of the rock formation, grouped together, facing the lodge. They stood perfectly motionless, rigid, their posture unnatural for anyone waiting for a boat or fishing. They looked like weathered, dark, stained stone statues, broken off from some ancient monument. Elias' throat tightened. He was seeing his grandfather. This madness come to life. Driftwood, sea lions. They were just rocks, he pleaded internally. He noticed a small, old wooden stand near the railing, clearly where Arthur had spent hours watching. On it lay a pair of heavy brass, rimmed binoculars. He seized them, ignoring the cold, salt, crusted metal, and brought them to his eyes. He steadied the lens, adjusting the focus until the world snapped into chilling clarity. The shapes resolved. They were definitely humanoid, small, slight figures, pale even at this distance, dressed in what looked like dark, heavy, soaked garments that blended into the rock. They were too thin, their limbs too long for children, but their height suggested youth, and they were, chillingly, completely still. No shift of weight, no movement of hair or clothing in the wind that buffeted Elias on the walk. As he watched one figure, the central one, slightly taller than the others, did something impossible. It did. T turn its head. It did. T lift an arm. It simply rotated its body, slowly, unnervingly, until it was perfectly facing the lodge, facing Elias. And then Elias realized something about the environment that shattered his remaining sanity. He was standing 40 feet above the Pacific Ocean. A rough, cold wind was screaming over the cliff face. Yet there was no sound of the surf, no crashing of waves, no roar of the tide receding over the shingle beach below. Only the howl of the wind passing through the lodge's chimney stack. The vast, kinetic energy of the sea, the constant, tremendous rumble of the ocean against the land, was simply absent. The sound had been drawn out. Elias stumbled back, letting the binoculars drop. They hit the wooden deck with a loud, sickening crack and rolled against the railing. He didn't wait to see if they fell. He spun around, yanked the door to the rotunda open, and slammed it shut, sliding the rusted bolt home. He scrambled down the metal spiral stairs, the clamor of his own feet, a terrifying noise in the silence of the house. He had come here to sell a house. He had found a prison, a seal, and a horrifying truth. Arthur had not been protecting his sanity from the outside world. He had been protecting the outside world from what was locked in Oakhaven. He was trapped in the lodge and out on the reef. The children were finally listening for his noise to stop. The house, Elias realized with gut-wrenching certainty, was no longer silent. It was waiting. The silence was a weapon, and Elias had just made noise. The metallic crack of the binoculars hitting the widow's walk, the frantic creak of the door slamming shut. These had been an admission, a panicked confession of presence in a house meant to be dead. He didn't waste time looking back at the spiral stairs. He descended them with reckless speed, fueled by the adrenaline of a man who has seen the irrefutable truth of his nightmare. He burst back into the main hall, stumbling on the polished floor. The sight of the cellar door, a dark, unyielding rectangle of wood near the fireplace, pulled his attention like a magnet. Arthur hadn't been a madman ranting about children. He had been a warden maintaining a prison, and the key to the prison was in the earth beneath the foundation. Elias sprinted back into the study. He snatched the ledger, his hands shaking so violently. He had to place it on the desk and flatten it with his forearm to read the frantic, final entries. He flipped past the drawings of the elongated figures and the cryptic notes on memory. He needed practical instructions. He found them scrawled haphazardly on the last page of the journal, dated 3 days before the executor had found Arthur's body peaceful and still in his bed. The geometry is failing. The salt lines are thin. The children are pressing on the seal. If I fail, the key to Ockhaven must be understood. The lodge is built upon the locus of absence. The cellar is the anchor point. When the silence deepens, when the sea ceases its roar, the tithing must be renewed. Find the box in the north wall. It contains the current lure. Place it before the tide returns. The tide is the window. Midnight is the deadline. Do not speak. Do not listen for the waves. Let the house be dead. Elias scanned the text again, his scientific mind screaming in protest, but his instinct screaming louder in agreement. Locus of absence, tithing, lure. It was liturgical madness, but it was the only map he had. The key was the box in the north wall. He needed light. He grabbed the heavy rechargeable lantern from his duffel, a piece of mundane technology that felt hopelessly inadequate against the supernatural gloom of the lodge. He needed a tool. In the back of the kitchen, he found a drawer full of old rusty utensils, a blunt knife, a claw hammer with a splintered handle, and a chisel. He took the chisel and the hammer. He approached the cellar door, breathing shallowly through his mouth, trying to minimize any human noise. He pulled the door open again. The rush of air was the same, freezing, dry, and tasting of potent, concentrated salt. He flicked on the lantern. The beam cut a raw, stark swath through the darkness. It was a steep, uneven stone staircase, descending into a space that was clearly excavated into the bedrock. The air immediately grew heavy, pressing against his eardrums. He started down, one hand flat against the cold, sweating stone wall for balance. The smell of the sea floor was almost overwhelming, but underneath it was the sharp, metallic tang he noticed earlier, like iron left out in the rain. The stairs ended in a vast single subterranean chamber. The walls were uneven blocks of granite, clearly reinforced. Unlike the dusty rooms above, this place looked meticulously, fanatically maintained. There was no dust, only a thin film of salt crystallization on every surface. It was a space consecrated to preservation. Along the floor, near the base of the walls, Elias saw evidence of Arthur's obsession, thick, uneven lines of white powder, meticulously laid down, salt lines. They ringed the perimeter, shimmering slightly in the lantern light, acting as a barricade against the stone. Elias carefully stepped over the first line. He moved the lantern beam around the chamber. There was no furniture, only stacked crates of supplies that looked decades old. Canned goods, bottled water, bags of rock salt, and several coils of thick, tar-soaked rope. It was a fallout shelter for one, except the threat wasn't T-nuclear. It was tidal. He searched the walls. The west and south walls were solid, unforgiving granite. The east wall held a small, cemented alcove where a pump and reservoir sat, presumably for the house's water supply. The north wall was the back wall, facing the sea. Elias walked to it, his boots grinding softly on the crystalline floor. The north wall was different. While most of the granite blocks were massive and unevenly cut, there was a central section, about 6 feet wide and 4 feet tall, where the mortar looked newer, a slightly darker gray. It was a patch job, deliberately hiding something. This was the location. The box was here. He set the lantern down, positioning it to illuminate the patched section. He picked up the chisel and the hammer. The sound he was about to make would be terrible, deafening in this silent subterranean chamber. But he had no choice. The tithing had to be found. He placed the tip of the chisel against a seam in the mortar and brought the hammer down. Crack! The sound exploded in the small stone room, slamming back at his ears, rattling his bones. A fine cloud of gray dust erupted, stinging his eyes. He paused, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, listening for any response. Above, the lodge remained silent. The reef remained silent. Only the pounding of his own blood was audible. He struck again and again, working around the outline of a specific central block. The mortar, though fresh-looking, was brittle. It chipped away, exposing the hard granite beneath. After 10 minutes of agonizing, repetitive noise, the rectangular block, smaller than the others, about the size of a microwave, wobbled. Elias wedged the chisel into the gap and levered with all his strength. With a grating sound of rock on rock, the block slid inward, tumbling onto the floor, with a soft final thud that seemed to settle the matter. Behind it was a cavity, not deep, but perfectly sized, and inside, resting on a bed of fine, coarse rock salt, was the box. It was not metal, but wood, a small dark box of teak, or some heavy, oily tropical wood, banded with tarnished copper strips. It had a heavy, miniature padlock securing the lid. Elias reached into the cavity, lifting the box out. It was shockingly cold, radiating a deep, penetrating chill that went straight through his palm. He needed the key. He scrambled up the stairs, ignoring the burning protest in his legs, and burst into the study. Back at the mahogany desk, he lifted the journal, and there it was, taped meticulously to the underside of the first page, a tiny silver-plated key, no bigger than his thumb, tarnished with verdigris. He carried the box and the key back to the cellar, moving now with a desperate, fearful efficiency. Back in the subterranean room, he knelt beside the lantern light and inserted the key. The tumblers ground together, and the small lock sprang open with a sharp snap. Elias lifted the heavy lid. Inside the box, resting on another bed of salt crystals, was a single object. It was a carved figure, no more than 10 inches long, fashioned from a single piece of dense, pale wood. Perhaps driftwood itself. It was clearly humanoid, but distorted. The head was smooth and featureless, the torso elongated and thin, and the limbs, the hands and feet, were disproportionately large, terminating in sharp, needle-like points. It was the figure from Arthur's drawing, and it was completely encased in a thick, shimmering crust of crystalline salt, so heavy and pure it looked like glass. The preservation was absolute. The figure felt impossibly cold, dead, and heavy in his hand. He found one final, folded note, tucked under the figure, written on brittle vellum. The lure holds the focus. The salt holds the boundary. The longer they stare at the lure, the deeper the silence. If the lure is removed, they will stare at the house. If the lure is damaged, they will focus on the man. This lure has held for 7 years. It must be replaced on the reef now. It must be a new lure. You must bring the new one and bury the old one in the sand. before the tide turns. A new lure. Elias looked back into the empty wooden box, then at the carved salt encrusted figure in his hand. Where would he find a new one? How would he carve it? Arthur had left him the mechanism, but not the means of replenishment. He was standing on the brink of an abyss, with only one piece of the terrible ritual completed. The heavy, suffocating air of the cellar seemed to grow denser. Elias stood up, gripping the carving. He didn't know how to create the new tithing, but he knew he had to deal with the old one, and he had to do it now. The reef was waiting. He started toward the stairs, but stopped dead. He felt the vibration first, a low, resonant thrum that traveled through the soles of his boots from the granite floor. Then he heard it. Not the ocean, not the wind, but a sound that originated inside the house, directly above him, in the main hall. It was a soft, wet, rhythmic slish, slish sound. It was the sound of a dark, heavy garment being dragged slowly across the dusty oak floorboards, and it was moving purposefully. Toward the staircase, someone, or something, was on the main floor. The silence, broken by his hammering, had allowed the children to leave the reef. The seal was weakening. Elias had minutes, perhaps less, to secure the lure and escape the lodge. He gripped the salt, crusted figure tighter, his focus shifting from Arthur's instructions to the terrifying, undeniable presence waiting for him above. The wet, rhythmic slish, slish sound stopped directly above the granite floor of the cellar. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound, but a taut, muscular quiet, focused and predatory. Elias froze, the salt, encrusted lure heavy and impossibly cold in his hand. He was kneeling beside the open cavity in the north wall, the lantern beam cutting a cone of light that served only to highlight his vulnerability. He was trapped. The stairs were his only exit, and whatever was moving upstairs was waiting at the head of those stairs. Arthur's last entry echoed in his mind. Do not speak. Do not listen for the waves. Let the house be dead. Elias was alive, a pulsing heart of noise in a house consecrated to non-existence. He had to become dead to sound. He moved with painstaking slowness, turning off the lantern. The stone chamber plunged into absolute sightless blackness. He could feel the panic rising, a choking sensation in his throat. But he beat it down with the sheer necessity of action. He had to make a sacrifice of noise now to achieve the greater silence later. He reached into one of the large burlap bags labeled rock salt near the foot of the stairs, scooping a large handful of the coarse, granular crystals. The salt was his boundary, his ritual defense. He slipped the lure into the deep inner pocket of his coat. It had to be protected, and began his ascent. The stone stairs were uneven. He pressed himself against the cold wall, placing his boots on the exact center of each riser to minimize the creak, relying solely on the muscle memory of his earlier descent. He moved a step, then paused, his ear straining against the silence. Slish. It was closer, impossibly close, just beyond the lip of the stairwell. Whatever was dragging itself was now stationary, listening for his ascent. Elias stopped breathing. He was halfway up, suspended between the sealed threat below and the active threat above. His mind raced, calculating the odds of a quick, loud rush. A quick rush meant sound, and sound meant attention. He chose the quiet. He took another agonizingly slow step. Slish, slish. The entity had mirrored him, moving only the instant he had. It was waiting, patient, playing a terrifying game of Marco Polo in the dark. And Elias was always Polo. He reached the top step. The blackness here was deeper, more textured, woven with the stale air of the main hall. He could feel the vast empty space around him. He crouched low, his free hand, the one clutching the rock salt, extended blindly into the space where the cellar door frame should be. He heard a soft, dry scrape against the wood, the sound of something heavy and brittle brushing the jamb. It wasn't tea dragging now. It was standing. Elias' eyes, useless in the dark, perceived a shape not through light, but through the absence of it, a column of absolute blackness that seemed to absorb the ambient shadow of the room, standing at an impossible height. The tall one from Arthur's cryptic entry, he acted. He hurled the rock salt with all his strength directly toward the column of shadow. The crystalline missile struck something, not wood, not stone, but something yielding and wet. There was a sound of wet fabric impacting wet skin, followed by a sound that made Elias' blood run cold. Not a scream, but a dry, hissing retraction, like air suddenly rushing out of a lung. Cavity, a sound of immense, shocked disappointment. The brief distraction was all he needed. He bolted, turning 90 degrees and running flat out towards the faint outline of the front door. He sprinted past the shadowy bulk of the grand fireplace, the heavy, dusty air swirling around him. He didn't. He looked back. He found the door handle, fumbling for the key Arthur had left in the lock, frantically twisting the large, cold iron key. The main lock turned. He yanked the door open. A sliver of gray, foggy daylight appeared, the promise of freedom. Then, the floorboards behind him exploded with sudden, kinetic force. The slishing stopped, replaced by a terrible jarring thud and the rapid, rhythmic scraping of heavy, sharp points on wood. It was moving too fast. Elias threw himself through the opening, slamming the massive front door shut behind him. He didn't bother with the key. He threw the heavy brass bolt on the interior side, hoping the sheer mass of the wood would hold it for a few seconds. He did. T stopped to look back at the vacant eyes of the lodge. He didn't reach for his truck keys. The truck was parked 200 yards away, down the treacherous widow. S-path he wouldn't make it. The deadline was the tide, and the tithing needed to be on the reef. He burst off the porch and into the oppressive humidity of the yard. The fog was a thick, shifting cotton blanket now, making visibility barely 20 feet. The silence outside was still complete, unnerving, devoid of gulls or surf. He ran blindly past the row of silent, stone-wind chimes, clutching the old lure in his coat pocket. He ran for the sound he could hear, the sea. He knew the general direction. The widow's walk had provided the view. He plunged into the woods along the cliff edge, tearing through damp ferns and low, hanging moss, ignoring the branches that clawed at his face. The ground abruptly gave way to loose, shale rock. He stumbled out onto the edge of the low cliff that overlooked the beach, catching himself on the moss, covered trunk of a massive fallen tree. Below him, the cliff dropped 50 feet to a narrow shingle beach. The tide was still out, exposing the treacherous expanse of black, slick rock leading to the reef. He scrambled down the cliff face, sliding and falling the last few feet onto the beach, the sharp shingles tearing at his hands. He barely noticed the pain. He pulled the salt, encrusted lure from his pocket. The wood was colder than the sea, spray radiating a deathly chill. He started across the shingle toward the tide line, his feet crunching loudly in the unnerving quiet. He kept his eyes on the distant, jagged silhouette of the reef, where the children stood watch. He looked back toward the lodge, which was now completely swallowed by the fog. He couldn't see it, but he could feel its weight, its presence. And then he saw movement, not from the reef, but from the dense, black tree line where the cliff met the beach. A shape detached itself from the gloom. It was tall, impossibly thin, and it was moving with a terrifying, purposeful slowness, not running, but gliding across the shingle, making a soft, terrible sound. Slish, slish. It had tracked him outside. The sound of the hunt was no longer confined to the house. Elias looked down at the old, salt, crusted lure in his hand, then out at the reef. He had maybe 5 minutes before the entity reached him. The tide would be turning soon. He began running toward the black, wet expanse of the exposed tidal rocks, desperate to finish Arthur's final ritual. The tithing must be placed before the deadline. Chapter 5. The Shingle and the Scrape Elias. Sprint across the shingle was a brutal, inefficient exercise in terror. The rounded stones offered no purchase. Every step was a small avalanche, a grinding noise that shattered the dreadful quiet and seemed to advertise his exact position. His lungs burned, and the cold, dense air was like breathing water. Behind him, the relentless, liquid sound of the pursuit intensified. Slish, 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 slish. It was closer now, not a hurried pace, but a calm, inexorable glide that covered ground far more effectively than Elias. Desperate scramble. He didn't dare look back. He kept his eyes fixed on the destination, the expanse of black tidal rock, stretching towards the menacing silhouette of the reef. He felt the presence of the creature not as heat or weight, but as a growing pressure on the air behind his back, an absolute suffocating void that seemed to suck the light and sound out of the foggy environment. It was stalking him, not with the malice of a predator, but with the cold, unhurried intent of a retriever. He finally reached the wet sand where the high tide mark met the exposed tidal flats. The ground here was firmer, but slick with seawater and algae. He scrambled onto the first massive, seaweed, slick rock, his boots skidding dangerously. He caught himself, his hand stinging from contact with the razor, sharp oyster shells crusting the stone. The creature stopped. Elias heard the cessation of movement, the final wet slish, and felt an immediate paralyzing dread. He risked a glance over his shoulder. Through the shifting scrim of the fog, perhaps 50 feet away, stood the tall one. It was truly immense, reaching nearly 8 feet in height, but unnaturally slender, like a figure stretched thin by gravity. It was draped in what looked like heavy, saturated black cloth that clung to its frame, but the fabric appeared to be composed of masses of tangled, dark kelp and soaked, decaying sea moss. The garment dragged on the shingle, accounting for the slish, slish sound. The thing had no discernible face. Where a head should have been, there was only the cowl of the dark garment pulled tight, creating a smooth, oval shadow above a neck that seemed too long and too thin to support even that meager weight. It held its arms stiffly at its sides, hands, if they were hands, hidden within the folds of the black growth. It stood exactly at the border between the dry shingle beach and the wet, slick tidal rocks, the border where the ground stopped being passive land and started being the fluid, shifting territory of the sea. Elias realized the creature was waiting. It was honoring some invisible boundary, a perimeter he had just crossed. He had a brief reprieve, but the clock was ticking. He had to bury the lure. He needed sand. The tide flats here were mostly rock and treacherous pools. He scrambled further out, desperately searching for a patch of exposed gravel or sand among the leviathan bones of the tidal rocks. He found it 20 yards out, a small, shallow pocket of gray, damp sand trapped between two massive, barnacled boulders. It was a miserable place, covered in the skeletons of dead starfish and broken shells. But it would have to do. Elias dropped to his knees, ignoring the sharp pain. He pulled the salt, crusted lure from his coat. It was beautiful in a terrible, stark way. the pale, distorted figure of the lure against the black rock, glistening with salt crystals. He used the butt of the small, salvaged chisel he still clutched to dig a small trench in the sand. It was slow work. The sand was compacted and dense. As he dug, he heard the first sound of the returning tide. It was a faint, almost inaudible whisper of water pulling at the base of the nearest reef rock. The deadline was approaching. Arthur's note, place it before the tide returns. He looked up at the tall one. It hadn't moved. It was still standing on the high watermark, an expressionless column of shadow, focused entirely on Elias. Elias finished the trench, maybe 8 inches deep. He placed the old lure into the hole, gently tipping it on its side, the pale wood contrasting starkly with the gray sand. He quickly scraped the wet sand back over the top, burying it completely. He packed the surface down with the palm of his hand, rubbing at the grains until the spot was indistinguishable from the surrounding sand. The instant the lure disappeared beneath the surface, the atmosphere shattered. It wasn't a sound that broke the silence. It was a pure, explosive release of energy. The air around Elias shimmered violently, like a heat haze on a summer road. A massive cold shockwave of displaced sound and force slammed into him, knocking him sideways onto the slick rock. He gasped, scrambling back up, expecting the tall one to rush him. But the tall one wasn't moving. It was convulsing. The entity had gone completely rigid, its long, dark form shaking violently at the boundary line. The wet kelp, like garments, seemed to writhe and coil, and the faceless cow snapped down towards the exact spot where Elias had buried the lure. It was no longer interested in him. Its focus was now absolute, magnetized, fixated on the buried wood. Elias realized the horrifying truth of the tithing. The lure wasn't a diversion or a protective ward. It was bait. It was designed to attract and hold the creature, its entire consciousness, sealing it away from the house and the coast by giving it one singular, compelling object to stare at until it was replaced. Arthur hadn't been protecting his grandson from the house. He had been protecting the reef, warden from the sea. The old lure, its power spent, had been replaced just in time. But the seal was only temporary. The tall one let out a soundless roar. The black cowl snapped back up, and the creature performed the unnatural, elastic motion Elias had feared. It did not move its feet, which seemed rooted in the shingle. Instead, its torso elongated, stretching forward in a smooth, sickening ripple, like a shadow cast by a sudden change in light. Its body extended across the exposed rock, instantly spanning the 20 yards that separated them. A section of the dark kelp, like garments stretched out like a whip, terminating in a point that was not a hand, but a cluster of thick, stiff needle. Like fibers, it struck the rock exactly where Elias had been kneeling, leaving a wet, corrosive scorch mark on the stone. The elongation was terrifying, defying all physical limits, and it brought the tall one's faceless cowl within feet of Elias. He could feel the profound, chilling cold emanating from its presence, the smell of ozone, and the deep, fetid stink of the ocean floor. The tall one began to contract, pulling its stretched out body back toward the shingle, the retreat accompanied by the sound of wet fibers rubbing against rock. The creature was momentarily anchored by the lure, unable to fully detach from the perimeter, but it had shown him its reach. Elias didn't. To wait for a second attempt, he scrambled back up, tasting salt and bile, his heart hammering against his ribs. The lure was buried. The seal was temporarily renewed, but he was still on the reef, and he was completely exposed. He turned and ran, navigating the treacherous maze of slick, black tidal rocks. keeping the creature in his peripheral vision. It was standing upright again, rigid, staring at the spot in the sand. But Elias knew that fixation would last forever. He reached the last outcropping of rock before the final scramble up the cliff. He glanced back one final time. The tall one remained motionless, a silent, black sentinel. But at its feet, where the dry shingle met the wet stone, a thin line of foamy seawater was creeping inward, licking the edge of the tall one's garment. The tide was officially turning, and with the tide, the sea's territory would expand, allowing the tall one to cross the perimeter. Elias began his frantic ascent up the loose shale of the cliff face, the chill of the lure's deathly cold still in his coat pocket, leaving the tall one behind to guard the brief, fragile silence. He had bought himself time, but now he had to figure out how to carve a new lure, or the next tide would swallow him whole. Elias scrambled over the edge of the cliff, collapsing onto the damp, needle-covered ground of the forest edge. He lay there for a long minute, tasting blood and grit, listening. The silence was still absolute, but it felt different now, no longer inert, but coiled and waiting like a snake asleep in the shadows. He could feel the weight of the tall one, silent magnetic stare, fixed on the buried lure far below. He got to his feet, pulling the chisel from his grasp. The sight of the lodge, emerging faintly from the patchy fog, sent a fresh wave of nausea through him. It was no longer a structure of stone and wood. It was the mechanism of a ritual, and he was the desperate acolyte. He approached the front door cautiously. The heavy brass bolt he had thrown was still jammed in place. He pressed his ear against the cold wood. No sound. Only the high-pitched ringing in his own ears, the ghost of the shattering silence. Elias had broken the seal of sound. He had hammered. He had screamed. He had bought time with a buried sacrifice. Now, he had to make the next one. He re-entered the lodge, moving with a heightened, almost animal awareness. The atmosphere was heavier than before, suffocating. The air felt thick with resentment, a palpable anger of a prison whose warden had failed. He moved directly to the study, not daring to pause in the vast echoing silence of the main hall. The study was exactly as he left it. The mahogany desk, the open ledger, the scattered legal pad. He ignored the ledger. He had extracted its final, functional truths. He started tearing apart the desk drawers, pulling out stacks of brittle, yellow documents. Arthur hadn't been a collector of secrets. He had been a systematic archivist of dread. He found nothing related to carving or wood, just bills, property deeds, and meticulously labeled folders filled with architectural plans for Oakhaven. It was one of the plans that stopped him. It wasn't the main blueprint. It was a detailed, hand-drawn cross section of the substructure, labeled simply the locus. The diagram showed the cellar, the granite blocks, the salt lines, and the wall cavity where the lure had been stored. But beneath the cellar, deep in the bedrock, was a complex interlocking network of 3 subterranean channels, all converging on a single, labeled point directly beneath the foundation, locus of absence, the convergence point. A separate, smaller drawing was taped to the plan, a sketch of the carving process with labels that were not words, but chemical and geological symbols. One symbol, a specific combination of iron oxide and quartz, pointed to a very specific type of rock. Arthur had drawn a small, perfect circle around the spot where the material could be found. The hearthstone. Elias turned, his eyes fixed on the grand fireplace, the centerpiece of the main hall. He walked to it, his boots scuffing the dusty floor. The hearth was a massive slab of dark mottled stone, veined with rust. red and crystalline white. Granite shot through with quartz and hematite. It was ancient, cold, and utterly dead. This stone was the tithing, not just wood, but wood carved from a specific ritualistically prepared material, cut from the very heart of the house. Seal, Elias needed a piece of that stone. He looked at the massive slab, then down at the blunt chisel and splintered hammer he held. He could T-chip this silently. The stone was too hard, the lodge too acoustic. He went back to the study, pulling his duffel bag open. Inside, amidst his civilian gear, was a forgotten box of tools, a drill bit kit, a small hand drill, and a selection of heavy-duty masonry attachments he had brought for structural checks. He returned to the fireplace. He had to be quick. He looked at his watch. 3:37 p.m. The fog was still thick, obscuring the horizon. He estimated the tide would reach the base of the cliff by 5 p.m., an hour and 20 minutes before the tall one would be truly mobile again. He selected the finest masonry bit he had. He knelt by the hearthstone, placing the chisel against a dark vein near the edge, then tapping it gently, searching for the softest point. He found a spot where the quartz seemed to meet the iron. Rich granite, a point of weakness. He started the drill. Vazat, the high-pitched whine of the drill, was a terrifying violation of the silence. It tore through the heavy air, echoing off the high ceilings like an animal scream. Elias flinched, expecting the slish to resume immediately. Nothing. The lodge held its breath. He realized the beautiful, horrifying geometry of the lure. Because the old lure was buried and holding the tall one, its focus, the seal was temporarily intact. But the sound was a constant risk. Elias pressed the drill hard, grinding through the stone. It was agonizingly slow work. The smell of burning stone and dust filled the air. He worked for 5 minutes, drilling a deep circular hole until the stone began to splinter. He withdrew the drill, placed the chisel into the groove, and hit it. Not hard, but with a sharp, controlled tap. Clink. A small, fist-sized chunk of the hearthstone cracked off. It was heavy, dark, and beautiful, the veins of quartz running through it like frozen bone. It was the lure's material. Now, he needed to carve it. Arthur's note showed a simple, stylized human figure, the elongated body, the huge claw-like hands and feet. It was meant to mimic the children, and the tall one. He had the hammer and chisel, but he needed finer tools. Elias remembered a room on the second floor he hadn't fully explored, a sitting room near the widow's walk. He ran up the main staircase, the dust rising in clouds around his sprinting form. He found the room and threw open the door. It was a small, dusty library. Along one wall stood a glass-fronted cabinet of curiosities. Inside, he found what he was looking for: a small, velvet-lined box of antique wood-carving tools, delicate, razor-sharp chisels, gouges, and knives, all perfectly maintained and sealed away from the damp. Arthur, the mad warden, had been a craftsman. Elias grabbed the box and returned to the study, slamming the tools onto the desk next to the raw piece of hearthstone. He sat down, his heart racing, and began to work. He focused entirely on the stone, letting his panic flow into the careful, precise movements of the knife. He stripped away the outer granite, exposing the core of the stone, the dense, crystalline heart. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The only sound was the delicate schnick of the razor, sharp steel carving the stone. He worked with a terrifying speed, driven by the knowledge that the tall one was waiting for the seal to fail. He shaped the torso, thin, long, defined. He created the smooth, eyeless head. He shaped the disproportionately large hands and feet, ending them in sharp, menacing points. He was working entirely from the image in Arthur's ledger, replicating the ritual object exactly. He was sweating, covered in dust, and the silence of the lodge was so profound, it felt like the entire world was holding its breath. He did not look at the clock. He did not look at the window. He carved. He had almost finished the final, claw-like foot when he heard it. It was faint, muffled, but absolutely unmistakable. The sound of water, a low, resonant whump followed by the receding shesh of a wave breaking against rock. The tide had reached the base of the cliff. The sea had begun its advance. Elias looked at the clock, 4:51 p.m. He had less than 10 minutes before the rising water would allow the tall one to leave the perimeter and resume its hunt. He finished the carving in a final, frantic burst, snapping the tiny knife blade. He held up the new lure. It was heavy, dark, and felt wrong. A magnet for an unseen terror. It was a new piece of the house, soul carved from the very hearth that sealed the locus. He snatched up the rock salt from the kitchen. Stuffing a handful into his pocket, he grabbed his lantern and headed for the front door, the new lure burning cold in his hand. He had to get back to the beach, cross the rising tide, and replace the old lure with a new one before the sea gave the tall one the freedom of the coast. The ritual was incomplete, and the tall one was about to be unleashed. Elias burst out of the lodge, the heavy front door slamming shut behind him, the sound muffled by the thick, encroaching fog. The atmosphere was radically changed. The air was no longer merely cold and quiet. It vibrated with an agitated energy, the low, frequency hum of immense force finally being released. He ran, the new lure, a dense, dark piece of carved hearthstone, a cold anchor in his hand. He sprinted toward the cliff edge, ignoring the dull ache in his legs and the sharp, gasping pain in his chest. When he reached the drop, off he peered down. The scene below was terrifyingly different. The sea, once placidly pulled back, was now a foaming, gray menace. The tide had fully turned and was advancing rapidly. The shingle beach was halved, and the low-lying tidal rocks were already being submerged by quick, relentless sheets of water. The tall one was gone from the boundary line. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Elias. The creature had been freed the moment the water touched the boundary, and now it was mobile. He scrambled down the loose shale, hitting the remnant of the beach with a bruising jolt. He scanned the swirling fog and water. Nothing. The tall one was simply too fast, too subtle. It could be anywhere. Elias had to reach the spot where he had buried the old lure. He started across the exposed rock flats, leaping from one slick, barnacled boulder to the next. The water was already ankle, deep in the crevices, chilling him instantly. He reached the two massive barnacled boulders where he had worked before. The small pocket of sand was submerged beneath a foot of rapidly flowing seawater. He could no longer see the surface of the lure's grave. He had to trust his memory and the feel of the terrain. He plunged his hand into the frigid, swirling water, feeling around desperately. The current was already strong, pulling against his arm. He found only slick rock and loose shells. Where is it? He pushed his arm deeper, straining to remember the exact depression. His fingers brushed against something, a shape that wasn't T-rock. It was rough, like encrusted wood, the old lure. As he felt the object, he simultaneously heard a sound that turned his blood to ice, a soft, whispering shesh, shesh. directly behind the massive boulder to his left, closer than he could have imagined. It was the sound of something large and wet dragging itself from a narrow pool. The tall one had used the rising tide to flank him, using the rock maze as cover. Elias yanked the old, salt, crusted lure from the sand. He held the two lures, the cold, beautiful new stone in his right hand, the rough, dead wood in his left, standing exposed in the rapidly deepening water. He had to make the swap. He dug frantically with his left hand, scooping away the wet sand and silt to deepen the pit. The tall one was moving now. He could hear the sound of its stretched, fibrous garment, rasping against the side of the nearby boulder. Elias glanced over the rock. The faceless cowl was already emerging, the long black form impossibly angled and reaching. It was not running or walking. It was slithering, liquid and fast, using the water as its medium. He had seconds. He dropped the newly carved stone lure into the hole, pushing it down hard into the wet seabed. The moment the stone touched the bottom, he felt the same violent atmospheric explosion as before, the massive cold shock wave of released energy. This time, the sound barrier dinned. He just shuddered. It recoiled violently. A deep, seismic thrum ran through the water and the rocks. The tall one half emerged from the water, snapped. Its elongated body locked into position, frozen inches from Elias. It was immediately, absolutely captivated. Its entire focus magnetized to the spot in the swirling water where the new lure rested. Its dark cowl, like head dipped down slightly, a posture of perfect silent devotion. Elias had succeeded. The new lure had taken the ritual bait, and the tall one was momentarily pinned again. But the ritual was not complete. Arthur's final instruction was the most terrifying. The worn piece must be removed from the property. It must be surrendered to the sea before the new piece is claimed by the dark. Elias looked at the old, wooden lure in his hand. It was brittle, spent, and covered in years of accumulated evil. He had to throw it into the open water, past the reef, to complete the cycle and banish the accumulated focus. He turned toward the open sea. The waves were cresting higher now, crashing onto the tidal flats in violent, foamy sheets. The reef was visible only as a dark, angular smudge against the fog. He ran to the edge of the deepest channel, a churning pool that was already waist deep. He knew he couldn't wade in, but he had to reach the deepest water possible. He wound up his arm, preparing to throw the wooden relic as far as he could. Just as he released the lure, he saw the three smaller figures, the children, on the reef. They hadn't moved since yesterday, but now they were leaning forward, their slender, dark forms angled like hungry raptors, watching him. Elias hurled the old lure. It flew, spinning end over end, across the churning pool. It landed with a soft, hollow plunk beyond the reach of the nearest foam. It bobbed briefly on the wave tops, a tiny pale speck against the vast gray ocean. The instant the wood settled onto the water, the children on the reef reacted. They moved simultaneously, plunging into the water with a smooth, collective motion that made no splash, no sound. They were gone. Elias watched the spot where the old lure floated. The water around it began to churn violently, a sudden, unnatural vortex forming where the three figures had disappeared. The lure was drawn down quickly, swallowed by the sea. As the lure vanished, a terrible final sound broke the silence of the coast. The raw, explosive throat of the ocean, the sound of the surf, the roar of the sea against the cliff, returned with the force of a sonic boom, deafening, vital, and terrifying. The sea had reclaimed its noise. He, the tall one, its spell of stillness broken by the returning sound, began to convulse violently. It tore its focus from the newly buried lure, and its elongated form whipped around, its faceless cowl snapping toward Elias. The boundary was holding the lure, but the creature was now free to express its rage. Elias didn't hesitate. He turned and ran, climbing the rocks toward the cliff. The tall one let out a high, dry, whistling hiss, the first sound Elias had ever heard it make, and began to pursue him, its long, scraping arms reaching across the rocks. He scrambled up the wet shale, using the deep, newly returned rumble of the ocean to mask his movements. He didn't stop until he reached the relative sanctuary of the lodge's doorway. He slammed the door shut, locking every bolt, and stumbled backward into the safety of the dark hall. He was alive. The seal was renewed. The tall one was anchored, and the sea's noise had returned. He leaned against the cold wood of the door, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the overwhelming, natural roar of the Pacific. But the terror was not over. He had spent the first lure. He had one night of safety, and in the morning, the tide would recede, and he would have to carve the next lure. He needed to find the complete ritual instructions, or Oakhaven would claim him when the seal failed again. The ledger lay open on the desk, waiting. Elias peeled himself away from the bolted front door, the deafening surge of the returned surf echoing in the hall. It was a cacophony of natural sound, yet it was the most terrifying noise he had ever heard. The ocean's roar, deep and constant, reminded him that the tall one was now mobile, its confinement depending entirely on the fragile, newly buried stone lure. He stumbled back into the study. The room was cold, the air thick with the dust of his panicked carving session. He collapsed into the leather armchair, grabbing a tattered wool blanket from the back of the seat, and drew it around his shoulders. He was shivering violently, not just from the cold of the sea-drenched clothes, but from the bone. Deep terror of realizing he had just participated in a successful, demonic ritual. He looked at the open leather ledger. It was no longer a record of lunacy. It was a manual of survival. He had bought himself one cycle until the next low tide. He had to find the full instructions. He ignored the dated conversational entries and focused on the center section, pages covered in mathematical symbols, complex diagrams of the lodge's substructure, and what looked like alchemical notation. His grandfather hadn't just been documenting his fear. He had been attempting to codify it. Elias ran his finger over a complex diagram of the locus, and a chilling realization struck him. Arthur had used two different vessels, the initial wooden lure, the one Elias just surrendered, and, later, the carved hearthstone, the one currently buried. The material itself was merely the shell. The conductor, the true tithing, was something else entirely. He found a page where the script was tiny and precise, almost invisible without magnification. It was titled, simply, The Exchange. The silence demands essence. It is not fed by flesh, but by that which makes the human resonant, memory, joy, and the particular noise of specific love. The carving is a vessel. To renew the seal, the vessel must be primed with a tithing, an element of the self. This element must be sealed into the carving's core. The exchange must be equal. The new vessel primed draws the dark one's focus and seals it. The old vessel, spent, must carry the accumulated absence back to the sea, where the children consume it, establishing the silence and preventing the house itself from collapsing into the locus. Elias felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. Absence. His grandfather's memories hadn't been consumed by time or age. They had been extracted ritualistically to keep the seal intact. This explained Arthur's entry. I cannot remember her face. If I cannot recall the laughter, does it mean it never existed? Arthur hadn't he forgotten his wife. He had sacrificed the memory of her laughter to the lure. Elias flipped the page and found a table, meticulously charting the tithing requirements. Arthur had categorized human essence into 3 types, each corresponding to a different length of time the lure would remain effective. Below the chart was the next set of instructions, labeled priming the vessel. To transfer the essence to the hearthstone, it must be contained. The sound of the chosen essence must be captured and sealed within the core chamber of the carved vessel. I used the lead-lined box from the attic, a temporary measure, to hold the essence before transfer. Elias now understood. He needed to find the lead-lined box and, more horrifyingly, decide what part of his own life he was willing to surrender to the silence to buy himself a few more days. He quickly scanned the entry for the box, its location. Arthur's script led him back to the widow, S walk, but not the tower itself. The box is secured in the space beneath the floorboards of the second, floor linen cupboard, accessible from the crawl space above the main hall. Its weight and density were necessary to contain the sound. While the carving was prepared, he had to go back upstairs to the second floor, a part of the house that felt increasingly alien and hostile. As Elias stood up, the house delivered a chilling reminder of its occupants. The roar of the ocean outside was a solid, constant wall of sound. But piercing through it, from somewhere in the walls near the grand fireplace, was a distinct, utterly dry sound. The light, brittle scrape of something moving across bare wood, followed by a faint, breathy giggle. It was the children, the return of the ocean's noise, while anchoring the tall one, had allowed the lesser entities, those who craved the absence of human noise, to become bolder, perhaps believing the lodge was now open for business. They were inside the house, mocking his fear, playing in the space between the walls. Elias grabbed the lantern, its weak yellow glow doing little to push back the deepening shadows. He moved quickly, silently toward the kitchen, where the stairs to the second floor were located. He reached the landing. The second floor corridor was a tunnel of oppressive darkness. He moved slowly past the closed doors of the empty bedrooms, his own breathing suddenly too loud. He reached the end of the hall, where a heavy antique chest of drawers stood, the linen cupboard. He pulled at the drawers, scattering dry, moth-eaten linens. Beneath the final, deep drawer, he found the access point, a small, circular wooden panel, secured by 2 brass screws. The sight of the screws made him pause. The tall one was temporarily sealed, but the children were active. He could not risk the sound of a screwdriver. He reached into his coat pocket and retrieved the small chisel he had used to chip the hearthstone. He worked the flat tip of the chisel beneath the screw heads, wiggling, prying, ignoring the excruciating slowness of the process. Finally, with a soundless, desperate heave, the screws groaned out of the dry wood. Elias dropped them into his pocket and lifted the wooden panel. Beneath the cupboard floor was a deep, dusty crawl space. Elias shined his lantern down, and there, sitting in the thick, dry cobwebs, was the lead-lined box. It was a dull gray cube, about the size of a shoebox, incredibly heavy, and sealed with an elaborate brass clasp. As he reached for it, he heard the scrape again, this time much closer. From the adjacent wall, a sound like fingernails lightly dragging down dry plaster, and then a series of quick, tapping noises, like a small hollow bone being gently rapped against the wood. Elias froze, his fingers inches from the box. He didn't. T snatched the box. He performed the most difficult act of all. He retrieved it slowly, carefully, gently. He pulled the heavy lead cube from the crawl space, his muscles straining against its weight. He replaced the wooden panel, securing it as best he could by jamming the loose screws back into their holes. An inadequate barrier. He fled the second floor. Back in the study, he placed the heavy box on the desk, the lead radiating a profound coldness. He had the knowledge, the vessel, and the collection chamber. Now he had to choose the tithing. What essential part of Elias Thorne, the rational academic, would he surrender to the silence to survive? And how would he lure that sound, that memory, into the lead-lined tomb? The next low tide was only a few hours away.